This is my third attempt at making this video. I actually had to put in a new camera, and hopefully this one works out like it's supposed to. So I'm continuing my Black History special. This one in particular is focusing in on the effects on slavery in America that the Civil War had on it, as well as the abolitionists and this whole thing with Lincoln. So black people looked at Abraham Lincoln as their savior, as their Moses, so to speak. You know, in the Bible, Moses was the guy who goes and frees the bondage people in Egypt. So in the slave's mind, here you have Lincoln, a white man, supposed to be one of this nation's own, taking a stance against this nation in terms of its ideology on slavery. So they look at Lincoln as their Moses, and naturally were clinging to his party, his political party. So the Civil War and its effects. Basically, before I really get into that, I want to talk about basically two sides of the coin, so to speak, when it came to the abolitionists. You got the abolitionists, both sides essentially wanted to see the abolishment of slaves. But you had the side that realized that slaves basically were in these states when America was formed, when America was created. And so with the signing of the Constitution in 1789, these states had slaves, and so these abolitionists felt, okay, well, we don't need to get involved in terms of fighting to get rid of those slaves, but I would like to see the the abolishment of slavery, but at the same time, in terms of extending slaves to the new territory, that no. So that was one of the sides of the coin, the side that they did not want to see slaves extended to the new territories. Now, basically, you had this imaginary line, north of this line, no slaves, south of this line, slaves. Now, it wasn't quite like that either because there were actually slaves in the north as well. I mean, New York City had slaves. Washington, D.C. also had slaves. In fact, the White House, the second time, dominantly built by slaves. The slaves had a lot to do with the building of D.C. and a lot to do with the building of New York City. But that being said, the main target here was looking at slavery in the South and not wanting to see slaves extended to the new territories. And this is the side that Lincoln was taking, that he never wanted to abolish slavery. While he was never seeking to abolish slavery, he was seeking to make sure that slavery was not extended to the new territories, regardless whether it was north or south of the line. This was a new territory. He wasn't going to come into the Union and get the rights of having slaves. But then, the other side of the coin was the abolishment of slavery altogether. And this is what the South feared when Lincoln took office. They feared that he was going to come in here and abolish slavery altogether. Despite he had said before that that was not his interest, that he simply wanted to be sure that slavery was not extended to the new territories. Now, the fact was that the South was in uproar about this anyway because they wanted slavery extended to the new territories. Here you have out there in the frontier all this mass land that could be used for farming, and they wanted to to go and buy this land, work this land. It was way more land, and they essentially wanted slaves to work them. So, the South was in uproar about this anyway. But its effects was dividing the nation. I mean, that basically the abolitionist movement wound up dividing this nation and leading to the issue of states' rights and to the Civil War. So, once the Civil War happened, how did the Civil War affect America? Well, we know that it torn America apart. The South never recovered from having slavery abolished. I mean, even to this day, the South never really had a full economic recovery. That being said, let's take a look at the effects that they have had on black people, that the Civil War had on black people. Slaves knew that there was a war going on, and that it was over the issue of slavery as they would see it. And so it became a big issue of what now? There's a war going on. They're fighting this war over slavery. And if they win, this could be some good things for us. Now, the South did not like the idea of implementing slaves into their ranks into this war. But they would be pushed to do so in the end, mainly because the North had superior numbers. I mean, the South, you can argue, had a better fighting force, but the North had superior numbers. And so at the end, it really didn't, it was basically a matter of math. At the end, the South was going to run out of men, and the North was going to be still sending them in. So, I mean, it was just a matter of math that, this was going to be over with in no time, which they all thought the war was only going to last a day, but the war lasted 4 years. So much for a day war. But it affects on slaves. Once slaves did have to start fighting in some of the Confederate ranks, you have to realize that prior to this, there was massive number of black people, slaves, non-slaves, fighting for the North, fighting for their freedom, because they wanted freedom. I mean, naturally, why would you not want to be free? Once the Civil War was over with, one of the stipulations set in place for the South is that they had to all ratify the 13th and 14th Amendment, because it would take 2/3 votes. And since the South was still a part of America, they had lost the war, they would need their votes. And so this was one of the stipulations. So with the 13th and 14th Amendment ratified, slaves now have their freedom. Okay, what is to come from this? Yes, slaves are now free, but now what? How are these slaves going to provide for themselves? Basically, it became a thing of consequence. You're free. Now, what are you going to do with your freedom? And so it is something that slaves had to learn to adjust to. And the idea of sharecropping really was just another form of slavery. So moving on from this point, my next video is actually going to be discussing the civil rights movement and how it was actually started up by skeptics and not by the religious faces that you see on it. I'm going to explain how these religious faces took over the movement, but how it was actually started by skeptics. And I'm going to start that up from where I left off today, basically talking about, okay, now, after the Civil War, what is happening. But that is going to conclude this video. Peace.